Parshas. Okay. This week's Sedra is Parshas Bamidbar, and Parshas Bamidbar, and as well as a good part of Chumash Bamidbar, focuses on the counting of the Jewish people and the different situations that took place in the Midbar, in the desert, as they're traversing the Midbar, going from Har Sinai, or going from Har Sinai towards Eretz Yisrael. And here it talks, Midbar talks about the encampment of the Jewish people around the Mishkan. As I've mentioned many times, the Mishkan is the perpetuation of the experience of Sinai, the continuation of the Sinai experience. And so it says, "Vayiraber Hashem Moshe Bamidbar Sinai bo'el moed be'echad lachodesh hasheni b'shana shenis l'tzei sameretz Mitzrayim leimor." Hashem spoke to Moshe in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first of the second month in the second year after their exodus from the land of Egypt, saying. And Rashi comments in the second month, in other words, Chodesh Sivan. So Rashi says, "Mitochi basim lefanav," because of the love that God has for the Jewish people. Mona osam kol shah, he's constantly counting them. Kishayatzu Mitzrayim manan, he counted them when they left Egypt. Ukshenaflu be'egel manan, and after the tragedy of the Egel, so he counted them also. Leida minyan hanosarim, in order, I would say, to make known how many survived the tragedy of the Egel, of the golden calf. Uchshabal hasro shchinaso aleihem, but when he wanted to reveal his presence on them, meaning in a more permanent fashion with the Mishkan, so he also counted them. He says, "Echad b'nisam hu kama Mishkan." So the Mishkan was set up in the first of Nisan, uve echad be'iyar mana, and on the first of Iyar he counted them. Now, I've always mentioned that it seems somewhat problematic. In other words, this count is being associated with the fact that the Mishkan was set up, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in a sense, revealed himself in a more permanent fashion to the Jewish people, in an ongoing fashion to the Jewish people. And all that took place on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu waited a whole month in order to count them. Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu wait a month to count them? Now, in the past, I mentioned the machlokes, the Rambam, the dispute between the Rambam and the Ravid. Now we know that there is a concept of Dushas Eretz Yisrael, that the land of Israel is sanctified. Many of the mitzvos, trumos, maestros, are dependent on the Dushas Eretz Yisrael, on the sanctification of the land. And I've explained it. I don't want to go into detail now, but the sanctification of the land, because as far as the ownership of the land of Eretz Yisrael was given over to the Jewish people from the time of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu acquired the land of Eretz Yisrael for all future generations. But the mitzvos hatluyas baretz, the mitzvos that are dependent upon the land, the mitzvos that are associated with the agriculture of the land, is dependent upon the dushas haaretz that took place after the Jewish people came into the land of Israel. So the Rambam, the sheet of the Ravid's opinion is that the mitzvah of building a Beis Hamikdash is only the mitzvah of having a Beis Hamikdash. There can only be sanctity of the Beis Hamikdash, of the temple. The temple has a unique dusha, even though it's a separate dusha, in addition to the dusha of that Eretz Yisrael has, the sanctity that the land of Israel has. But the Ravid Shita is there can only be sanctity of the Mikdash, of the temple, when there's Dusha Eretz Yisrael, when there's sanctity of Eretz Yisrael. Let's say, according to the Ravid's opinion, during the 70 years between the first Commonwealth and the second Commonwealth, when the Jewish people went into Babylonian exile, so there could be no sanctity of the Temple Mount, because there was no Dushas Eretz Yisrael. There was no sanctity of the land of Eretz Yisrael. One of the prerequisites, according to the Ravid's opinion, for the sanctity of the Mikdash, of the temple, is that there has to be Dushas Haaretz. There has to be the sanctity of the land. And when there is no sanctity of the land, there can't be sanctity. There can't be the special sanctity of the temple. Let's say during the 70 years between the first temple and the second temple, between the first Commonwealth and the second Commonwealth, according to the Ravid's opinion, one could not, on the site of the temple, one could not give korbanos, could not give sacrifices, according to a certain understanding of some of the mefarshim, of some of the commentaries. Someone who was tamei, someone who was contaminated, during that 70-year period when there was no dushas haaretz, when the mitzvos, the agricultural mitzvos of the land of Israel didn't apply. So somebody who was tamei, someone who was contaminated because he came in contact with the dead, was not allowed to walk in certain areas of the Temple Mount. I mean, was allowed to walk in certain areas of the Temple Mount, because the prohibition of walking on the Temple Mount is only when there's Dushas HaMikdash, when there's the sanctity of the Mikdash, the sanctity of the site of the temple. And according to the opinion of the Ravid's opinion is there is only Dushas HaMikdash when there is sanctity to the land of it, to the land of Israel. If there's no sanctity to the land of Israel, there can't be sanctity to the temple, to the site of the temple. And there's a discussion also, I don't want to go into it now, about the situation today. Whether the Ravid's opinion is for another reason, an additional reason, there is no sanctity to the Temple Mount today, but for another reason, an additional reason. But whatever it is, the sanctity of the Temple Mount is dependent upon the sanctity of the land of Israel. And the question is, what is the connection? Why is there a connection? And I have mentioned, what is the sanctity of the land of Israel manifest itself in? Now, when did the land become sanctified? Possession of the land, even the presence of God's presence in the land of Israel, that's from the time of Avraham Avinu, from the time of Abraham. Possession of the land of Israel, belonging to the Jewish nation, that's also from the time of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu, our patriarch Abraham, he acquired the land on behalf of the Jewish people when he entered the land of Eretz Yisrael. But the sanctity for the mitzvos hatluyos ba'aretz, the sanctity that makes us required in the mitzvos that are associated with the agricultural produce of the land, that only took effect after the Jewish people came into the land of Israel. So, what's the idea behind it? But I think the idea behind it is that the sanctity of the land of Israel is associated, the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, the sanctity of the land of Israel is associated with land of Israel being not just the possession of the Jewish people, but the residence of the Jewish people. And what's the reason for that? Because the Torah says, "V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'socham." You shall make me a mikdash. You shall make for me a temple, and I will reside in their midst. The temple was not seen just to be a place that we will come on occasion. The purpose of the temple was to reside among the Jewish people. In the desert, as Parshas tells us, the Jewish people camped around the Mishkan. They camped around the Mishkan. Each tribe had its own place, its own camp. And you had on each side of the Mishkan four camps, and each camp had 3 camps for each tribe. But the Mishkan wasn't just a place that we came to serve God. The Mishkan was a place that to give us the idea of God being in our midst. The Jewish people, prior to Matan Torah, prior to the Mishkan, they were constantly making the mistake of asking, "Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu u'mayin?" Is God in our midst or not? It's essential for the Jewish people to know that God is always in their midst. And the Jewish people camping around the Mishkan, in a sense, was one of the main purposes of the Mishkan. In other words, when the Sinai experience was there, everybody sensed the presence of God. But how did the Jewish people come? How did the Jewish people come to build a golden calf? Somehow they only identify God's presence in their midst when Moshe Rabbeinu was in their midst. But when they thought that Moshe Rabbeinu died, when Moshe Rabbeinu did not return on the moment that they thought he would return, and they said to Aaron, Tizeh Moshe Nish, Lo Yadanu Mehayalo, Moshe, this mortal man, we don't know what happened to him. So then they built a golden calf. 40 days beforehand, they said, Nasa v'nishma. They were on a level higher than the malachim, higher than the angels. But then, 40 days later, they stand before a golden calf and say, Elu Elohecha Yisrael. Because they didn't see, they weren't able to feel that closeness to God. So the purpose of the Mishkan was not just to have a place to do the avodah. And I'll explain that also. But the purpose of the Mishkan, the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash, was to have God residing in their midst. Now, there is a discussion. During periods of time when the Beis HaMikdash, during periods of time of exile, whether the let's say in the exile, the Roman exile. So the Rambam's opinion happens to be that Eretz Yisrael had Dusha Saretz. The Rambam's opinion is that during the first exile, there was no sanctity to the land of Israel. But in the second exile, there was sanctity to the land of Israel. Why is it that way? So the Rambam says the first exile was through kibush, through conquest. During the first temple period, during the first commonwealth, the land of Israel was sanctified through kibush, through conquest, by virtue of Yehoshua's army. That's who sanctified the land of Israel. He says conquest, the sanctity that comes through conquest only lasts as long as the conquest lasts. But in the second Beis HaMikdash, how was the land of Eretz Yisrael sanctified? The land of Eretz Yisrael was sanctified by the Jewish people going up to the land of Eretz Yisrael, by building their houses there, by plowing the fields, by residing there. It's true. When they fought the war, they also resided there afterwards. But residence that comes through a war or as part of a war is viewed, as we know today in all the newspapers, is viewed as an occupation. So when the army leaves, when the occupation is over, the dusha that came as a result of the act that is identified with occupation also comes to an end. But when they come up a second time and they reside there and they live there, so it's not just an occupation. It's not just, the land is not just seen as a place that we control, but it's a certain sense of identification. Our homeland, So even when we go away, when we leave our house still remains our residence. So during the second Beis Hamikdash, during the second exile, during the Roman exile, Eretz Yisrael retained, the land of Israel retains its Kedusha, retains its sanctity. Why? Because it was recognized as the residence of the Jewish people, according to the Rambam's opinion. So now the Ravid's opinion is that there can only be sanctity to the Beis Hamikdash, to the temple, when the Jewish people, when there's sanctity to the land of Israel. Why? Because the land of Israel, the Kedusha of the land of Israel represents the fact that Eretz Yisrael is now not just the possession of the Jewish people, but it is the residence of the Jewish people. So if it's the residence of the Jewish people, so then there is a purpose for the Beis Hamikdash to be in existence. For Asuli Mikdash Shachanti B'Socham, the Beis Hamikdash has to be God's residence among the Jewish people. In a sense, God resides together with us in our residence. So, in other words, the building of the Beis Hamikdash and even the avoda itself is not to be seen as the only ultimate goal. Part of the goal of the Beis Hamikdash is to see God in our midst. That the Jewish people should no longer say, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu emayim. It's not only Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu emayim. In other words, we have to constantly, consciously be aware of God's presence. So this is the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash, to reinforce the sense of the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu among the Jewish people. And I think that perhaps this is the idea why it was only counted. Today, we have all these kiruv organizations, and they do a lot of good, don't get me wrong. And they start, and they have to start that way, but they start off with a religious encounter. Call it a religious experience. But the religious encounter and the religious experience comes to an end. You have religious weekends. But what happens when there is no follow-up? No continuation? The giving of the Torah was a meeting between God and the Jewish people. The building of the Mishkan was to perpetuate that association. In other words, the Mishkan was not just for us to go to God, but for God to be in our midst. It was, so that's the idea, 30 days. 30 days, we say, and certainly in Chutz La'aretz, when does one have to put up a mezuzah in their house? At 30 days. 30 days is considered in regard to other halachas also. It's a certain degree of residency. So we're counted 30 days after the Mishkan, a month after the Mishkan is set up, after God's presence is made known in the Mishkan. 30 days later, a month later. So then the Jewish people are counted to emphasize the counting, to emphasize the point that the purpose of the Mishkan wasn't just to do the avodah. Had the purpose of the Mishkan been only to do the avodah, we could have been counted shortly after Rosh Chodesh Nisan. But part of the goal was the ongoing relationship. And it's very interesting. I've mentioned the question. On one hand, the Rambam says that the Beis Hamikdash ain't bonim Beis Hamikdash al b'layla al b'yom. The Beis Hamikdash can only be built in the day, and the Rambam also says that women are chayavos. Women are required. Everybody is required to participate in the building of the Beis Hamikdash, either through donating money, donating whatever it is for the Beis Hamikdash, participating in the actual building. Everybody's required to participate. Now we know there's a general rule that women are not required in a mitzvah saseh shehazman grama, in a mitzvah that's dependent upon time. Women are not required unless there is a special Xeris HaKosav, a special indication that women are required. For example, the mitzvah of matzah. Eating matzah and Pesach is certainly dependent upon time. But nevertheless, the Torah requires women to eat matzah. Torah tells us that whoever is prohibited from eating chametz is required to eat matzah. And women, of course, are required in all the prohibitions of the Torah. So consequently, even though the positive commandment of matzah is dependent upon time, there is a special indication in the Torah that women are required in the mitzvah of matzah. So the question is, why does the Rambam say that women are required in the mitzvah of the Beis Hamikdash, in the mitzvah of building the Beis Hamikdash? The Beis Hamikdash can only be built in the day. There are many answers. But one of the answers is because the mitzvah of building the Beis Hamikdash is fulfilled not just by the actual building of the Beis Hamikdash. On the contrary, we could suggest that the building of the Beis Hamikdash is the Maisa HaMitzvah. It's like the act of putting up a mezuzah. But the fulfillment of the mitzvah of mezuzah is not in the putting up of the mezuzah, but of having the mezuzah up. The fulfillment of the mitzvah Beis Hamikdash, whether building the Beis Hamikdash is part of the fulfillment or it's just the Maisa mitzvah, the act of the mitzvah could be discussed. But the main fulfillment of the mitzvah of the Beis Hamikdash is in having the Beis Hamikdash, in having the presence of God in our midst. It's an ongoing mitzvah. It's a mitzvah t'midus. And to emphasize the emphasis of that point, and even when we say the avodah is also from that perspective, but I'll get into that later. Now, it's very interesting. There's a discussion in the Gemara. What's a klal gadol shebet Torah? What is a great principle of the Torah? So the Gemara, the Mishnah, they mention one klal gadol is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. I've discussed that many times. Another Klal Gadol is Zeh Sefer Toldos Adam. This is the book of the history of man, that man was created in the image of God. But the Medrash adds a third pasuk. What's a Klal Gadol b'Torah? What's a great principle of the Torah? As a keves echad tasa b'boker, as a keves hasheni tasa ben arbayim. The giving of the morning and evening sacrifice. That's called the constant sacrifice. Always. What is that? That sacrifice that's given every morning and every evening. What is that indicative of? That was indicative of the fact that the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the service of God, has to be a constant service. It's true. We give the carbon in one moment. But it reminds us of the fact that we are servants of God. A servant, a slave, I like to use the word servant, belongs to his master. And he is a servant 24 hours a day. He might have certain tasks, but those tasks remind him that he belongs to his master. That's why Karbanos is identified as Avodah, because it's not just the giving of the sacrifices, but the Karbanos have to remind us that we belong to God. I mentioned many times what the Rishonim say, that the word Karban comes from Karov. The Al-Shich says the Al-Shich says that why did God accept the sacrifice of Hevel and reject the carbon of Cain? The Hevel Hevi Gamhu made Korosono. When he brought his sacrifice, he gave himself over. This was the external sacrifice, was just symbolic of giving himself over. Cain thought he was giving something to God. Hevel said, no, God owns everything, but I'm giving myself over to God. I'm showing that I recognize that I belong to God. So the daily sacrifice, which is identified as the carbon tamid, the constant carbon, the carbon that's given every day, that is a Klal Gadol b'Torah, because that's indicative of the fact that our service to God is not an occasional service, but it's indicative of the fact that we're constantly in the service of God. Now, it's very interesting. I mentioned it. The Rambam's opinion is that, the way Reb Chaim explains the Rambam, the mitzvah of lighting the menorah. Well, the Ramban raises, Rashi raises a question in Parshas Bahaloscha, which comes after Parshas Naso. So in Parshas Bahaloscha, the Torah tells us about the mitzvah of Aaron to light the menorah. Bahaloscha daber al Aaron, Bahaloscha sanero, speak to Aaron and tell him, then you light the menorah, mul pnei menorah tiru shivas aneros. So the mitzvah of lighting the menorah, so God told Moshe to tell Aaron about the lighting of the menorah. And that's mentioned immediately after the Torah talks about the sacrifices that the Nesiim, that the prince of each tribe gave. And Rashi and the Ramban, they're troubled. Why is it? Why is it that that immediately after telling us that the prince of each tribe gave a special sacrifice, a special korban, a special donation to the Mishkan, or special donations to the Mishkan, that immediately afterwards the Torah tells us that Aaron has to light the candles. And the Medrash says, when Aaron saw that the 12 Shvatim, the 12 tribes, all participated in giving this special korban, these special sacrifices, this special donation to the Mishkan, and lo hu v'lo shifto, but he wasn't among them, and Shevet Levi wasn't among them. So he was a little concerned. And God said, Aaron, don't be concerned. Your portion is greater than theirs. Because you fix the menorah. You light the menorah and you fix it. Now, the question is, what's the significance of the fact that Aaron fixes the wicks of the menorah, that he lights the menorah? Madlik u'meitiv es menorah, you light the menorah and you fix the wicks. What's the significance of that fact? After all, why didn't God appease Aaron about all the other things that Aaron did? Aaron did all the service. Aaron went into the Kodesh Kadoshim on Yom Kippur. Aaron was in charge of the whole Beis HaMikdash. The Ramban asked this question. So the Ramban gives an answer, but I think according to the Rambam, we have a very simple answer. Rabbi Chaim says that according to the Rambam, the mitzvah of menorah, the fulfillment of the mitzvah of menorah was in its being lit. In its being lit. The fixing of the menorah, the fixing of the wicks, the changing of the oil that kept the menorah lit the whole time. That was not the fulfillment of the mitzvah, but that enabled the fulfillment of the mitzvah. That enabled the menorah to constantly be lit. But the fulfillment of the mitzvah was in the fact that the menorah was constantly lit. So, in a sense, the lighting of the menorah represented the idea, even though Aaron's lighting of the menorah and Aaron's fixing the menorah, it was done, the fixing of the menorah was usually done in the morning and in the evening. So, but the fulfillment of the mitzvah was in its being lit. Why? Because the service of God has to be a constant service. And the lighting of the menorah has to be a constant service. And it's interesting, the lechem hapanim had to be on the shulchan. The breads that were on the table of the Mishkan and of the Beis HaMikdash that lay there all week. What was it symbolic of? It was symbolic in the whole idea of service. What's the idea? Sukkot, before the rainy season, we pour water on the Mizbeach. I've mentioned why. Because it's not that we're giving water to God. But when we pour the water on the Mizbeach, when we pour the water on the altar, we're showing that we recognize that God is the source of everything. Just like Hevel, when he gave his korbanos, he gave his sacrifices. It wasn't so much that he was giving to God, but it was the recognition of everything that he had was from God. That's why Hevel gave from the best of his flock, whereas Cain gave from the worst, because Cain saw the sacrifice that he was giving to God. If he was giving, anything he gave was a generous gesture. But Hevel recognized it was symbolic of the fact that he belonged to God, symbolic of the fact that everything that he had was from God, so it also belonged to God. So the lechem hapanim, and lechem represents a special challenge, because bread, it's very interesting. When we eat vegetables, we say bore pri ha'adama. But when we say bread, when we make a bracha on bread, we say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Now the bread doesn't grow from the land. The wheat grows from the land. The wheat grows from the land. But what's the idea? The idea is, because when you see something in its a natural state, whether it's meat, of course it had to be shechted. It had to be processed. But more or less, you recognize it as something that you got from nature. But bread does not have the form at all of the wheat or the seeds of wheat that were the source of the bread. And that seems to be, this was something that I made. So the lechem hapanim represents the idea that even those things that were produced, it was only because of God that it was produced. It was grown by God. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Now, what's the difference between Adama and Haaretz? Adama is the earth. Haaretz is the land. The land is usually identified with man. Adama is nature. So when it comes to bread, we say in the bracha haaretz, because we're talking about the land with man's involvement in the land. But even that was from God. So hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Yes, I baked it and all that. No, it was God who gave it to me. And that's the idea of lechem hapanim, because all the kabbanos was indicative of the idea that God is constantly supplying our needs. Our relationship with God is an ongoing relationship. It's a permanent relationship. It isn't the 2-minute relationship. God is always there for us. We have to always recognize his being there. And it's interesting when it comes to tefillah. So the pasuk in Mishpatim, the mitzvah of davening. So the Torah says that that you'll serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Parshas Mishpatim. The Torah says you'll serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu uveirach es lachmecha v'esmeinecha. It's a parak Chav Gimel in Shemos, pasuk Chav Hey. V'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem uveirach es lachmecha v'esmeinecha v'hasirosi machla mikirbecha. So it identifies davening. with the basic needs, the physical needs of life. Bread, water, and removal and health. Removal of the illness from our midst. What's the idea of avoda? Tefillah is called avoda. It's called service of God. Why is it called service of God? It's called service of God because, let's say, you have a long Shemoneh Esrei. Say a person daven Shemoneh Esrei a half hour. But the idea of tefillah, it's called avoda. It's the servile work. Sometimes you hire a worker. The worker doesn't belong to you. But if you hire a servant, so you belong, if you are a servant, you belong to a certain degree to your master. When we daven, and daven is associating and recognizing HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the supplier of all our needs. That's the idea. God is the source of our able to continue to exist, constant existence. God is there. So we have to recognize that we constantly belong to him. Yes, we daven 1 time a day, 3 times a day. But part of it is recognition of our belonging always to him. And therefore the tefillah is associated with God's constant giving us the ability to survive and constant giving us the ability to continue living and supplying our constant needs. So, and it's very interesting. The Rambam's opinion is that a person has to daven. A person has to daven on a biblical level once a day. Rabbinically, you have to daven 3 times a day. But Midiyarais, you're chayav to daven once a day. And the Rambam points out, and therefore, women, the Gemara, our text in the Gemara might be somewhat different, but the Rambam apparently had a text, at least according to some of the Parshas, that women are required in the mitzvah of davening, because the mitzvah of davening is a constant mitzvah. They have to daven once a day. So why is it constant? In other words, because every moment, the mitzvah tefillah is a constant mitzvah. It's, in a sense, recognition of the fact that we are in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And every day, and any moment of the day is proper to daven. But it's considered that we are constantly serving him if we daven every day. So it's considered a constant mitzvah. If there was a period of time that there was no mitzvah davening, it wouldn't be a constant mitzvah. Let's say Kriya Shema. Kriya Shema, the mitzvah in the morning is 3 hours in the day. After that, there's no more a biblical mitzvah of saying Shema. But the mitzvah tefillah is every moment of the day. But it's every day. It's tamid. What's the idea? The idea is that we're constantly in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But when we daven every day, it's indicative of the fact that we're constantly in his service. And it's the Rambam, there's a strange Rambam. The Rambam says that Midiyarais, you're required to daven once a day. On a biblical level, you're required to daven once a day. But the Rambam also says that there is a prohibition of eating. There is a prohibition of eating in the morning until you daven. I'm not talking about people who are weak, and there are situations where it's mutter. I'm not going into those issues right now. But on a theoretical level, one is not allowed to eat in the morning until he davens. So the question is, if the mitzvah on a d'oraisa level, on a biblical level, is once a day, and we know in Jewish law, the day begins with the night. So why is this halacha, lo sochlu al adam, which the Rambam felt is a biblical halacha? Now, as he says in Sefer HaMitzvos, not to eat before davening, it applies only in the morning. If the mitzvah of davening is once a day and the day begins at night, so the prohibition of eating before davening should apply at night. Why does it start? Why does it start in the day, in the morning? But I think in regard to davening, in regard to the mitzvah of davening, the day begins with the day, and the night is part of the day. Now the question is, why is that? We know halachically, the day always begins with the night. And the answer is, when we talk about a particular day of the month, a particular day of the week, the day halachically begins with the night. But when we look at the day from the perspective of constant, you have to daven once a day because you always have to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You have to serve God constantly. And it's a mitzvah that applies throughout the whole day. But you can fulfill it from the beginning of the day. Then the day begins with the day. When you talk about mitzvahs of a particular day, or mitzvahs that don't go through the whole day, that are not constant, then the day begins with the night. But when you're talking about mitzvahs that are always there, that are there every moment, but it's accomplished by doing it once a day, then the day begins with the day. So the mitzvah of davening is a constant mitzvah. Why did the halachas say daven once a day, and that will be considered as if you're always serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Because when we daven with the sense that we belong to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We belong to God. I mentioned what my father said, that in Vayakel Pekudei, when Moshe Rabbeinu saw the work that the Jewish people did on the Mishkan, he used two expressions. One was malacha and one was avoda. And my father said, malacha, what does malacha mean? Why does the Torah use the word malacha? My father said, malacha is not just work. He says, avoda, that represents servile work. But malacha, we talk about meleches machshavos, that's identified with skill, with like being an artist. An artist injects his personality into his creation. They put themselves into the work that they do. My father said that when it came to the Mishkan, when it came to the building of the Mishkan, the Jewish people injected their personality. They put themselves into the work that they did. So that's why it uses the word malacha. But the work itself was servile. It was also a servile avoda. The question is, in what way is it a servile avoda? My father didn't answer that question. But I think what my father meant was, an artist, when you hire an artist creates something for you, but he doesn't belong to you. He produces something for you. But a servant, a slave, he belongs to his master. The Jewish people, but a slave, he just does the work. He doesn't put his personality into the work. He doesn't identify with the work. The Jewish people in Egypt didn't identify with the work that they did. They just did it. They didn't consider it their personal creation. They didn't identify it. When it came to the Mishkan, on one hand, they worked, but they did it because they recognized themselves as belonging to God. On the other hand, when they also they identified with it. They injected their personality, so to say, into it. So, but part of building the Mishkan was to see themselves as servants of God. And that's why tefillah, it's once a day, but it's at any time during the day. The whole day is dedicated to tefillah. Why? Because when we daven, we don't daven as once a day. We for that moment, we're recognizing ourselves as being servants of God all day long. When we recognize ourselves as being servants of God all day long, and we can daven any time during that day. So it's a halacha of constant service. We're in the constant service of God. Since we're in the constant service of God, it's a mitzvah t'midis. It represents the ongoing relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is the idea. This is the whole idea of avoda. See, even when it came to karbanos, and karbanos can only be in a certain time, it didn't reveal itself in the same way as tefillah did. But nevertheless, part of the idea of the avoda of the service, especially the carbon tamid, was the idea that we're in the constant service, to remind us that we're in the constant service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the idea of the Mishkan, the idea of having the Mishkan, was to know that we're in the constant service constantly in His service, but even more than that, that He is constantly, that we are together with Him constantly. And that's indicative, in a sense, that has implications in us, even when we're away, even when we're not in Yerushalayim, even when we're not in Eretz Yisrael. There's an idea that we have to constantly sense the presence of God. The Rambam, when he says the mitzvah of Anochi, we have to know, the Ram says, Yisod haYisodos v'Amud haChochmos, the foundation of everything, the foundation of all knowledge, is the foundation of all foundations, is that we have to know of God's existence. That He was there first, and He's constantly bringing out everything that there is. God is the one that brings everything out. What is Leida? The Rambam doesn't say lahamin, to believe. He says Leida. In other words, Leida is, my uncle says in Al Tshuva, it's to experience. You have to see God being constantly there with you. The Mishkan, when we reside around the Mishkan, that reminds us of God constantly being with us. But when we're not near the Mishkan, we have to constantly remind ourselves. We have to sense God's presence. As my uncle said, you see the sun going up, you see God putting the sun up. So this is, in a sense, we have to sense the presence of God wherever we are. And the idea of the Mishkan, the idea of the Avodah, that's the idea also of God constantly, of us being constantly reminded that God is in our presence. And we should never say, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayim. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Moshe. Questions in the chat, please. We have one question. Could you please repeat and further explain the conceptual differences between Ha'adama and Min Ha'aretz?
Yes. When you take a fruit, when you eat a fruit, you see what grew in the land. You see that it's something that was produced by God. But when you hold a piece of bread, it was made, the first impression you have is, this is something that was made by man. Now, Adama is the earth. Eretz, we talk about the land. We talk about Eretz Yisrael, the land of the Jewish people. It's not separating the land. By Adama, we see the Adama as separate from the man. But when we talk about Eretz, we talk about the different lands. The land of the Canaanites, the land of the Jews. It's the identification, it's a perception of the land together with people. So when it comes to bread, we say Hamotzi Lechem Min Aretz, because there we see man's involvement, but we have to say it's God who produced it. But when it comes to fruit, we don't necessarily see man's involvement. We see, when we look at it, of course, it could be man planted it. But when we hold that fruit in our hands and we're about to put it into our mouth, we see what God produced, not what man produced.
Any more questions? Looks like no more questions.
Okay. Okay, we'll make an announcement about the share next Sunday. I might have a meeting at that time, so we'll see what the story will be.
Okay, thank you, Moshe. We'd also like to wish everyone, all the mothers, a happy Mother's Day. And this week is also Yom Yerushalayim, so happy Yom Yerushalayim to everyone. Very significant day in the history of Klal Yisrael. Thank you.